58,000 meters of climbing, 7 summit finishes, a time trial through a tax haven, and a final week that ends in the Sierra Nevada on a climb most fans have never even heard of. If you think that sounds like a fun 3 weeks of racing, you have clearly never tried to ride a bike up a mountain. This is the 2026 Vuelta a España, and by the time it rolls into Granada on the 13th of September, it may go down as the hardest Grand Tour route in modern memory. Here's exactly why this race is going to wreck people. Start with the raw numbers, because they set the tone for everything else. The route covers roughly 3,275 kilometers across 21 stages, with more than 58,000 meters of total elevation gain. To put that in perspective, that is enough vertical climbing to summit Everest from sea level more than 6 times over, spread across 3 weeks of racing that also includes sprints, time trials, and 2 rest days that riders will need far more than usual. Only one recent Vuelta, the 2024 edition, with just under 60,000 meters, has topped that number. Everything else in the last several years falls short. The race doesn't even start in Spain. For the 3rd year running, the Vuelta organizers have sent the peloton abroad for the Grand Depart, and this time, it's Monaco's turn to host history. The Principality becomes the first city ever to have hosted the opening stage of all 3 Grand Tours, having already sent off the Tour de France back in 2009 and the Giro d'Italia decades before that. Stage 1 is a 9-kilometer individual time trial that starts beside the Monte Carlo Casino, weaves through tight technical corners, and hands out the first red jersey of the race. It looks tame on paper. It is not tame in practice, because a short, punchy time trial like this rewards explosive power over raw engine size, and it sets up rivalries that will simmer for 3 weeks. From there, the race heads into southern France before it even touches Spanish soil, and this is where the bloodbath narrative really starts to take shape. Stage 2 is the longest of the entire race at over 215 kilometers, rolling from Monaco toward Manosque with a couple of early climbs that come too soon to matter for the general classification, but which will absolutely soften legs for what comes after. Stage 3 is where the real trouble starts. After 100 flat kilometers, the peloton hits the Category 1 Col de Montlouis with about 15 kilometers to go, then climbs straight into the mountaintop finish at Font-Romeu, a ski resort sitting at nearly 2,000 meters of altitude. That's Stage 3. Riders are already fighting for their lives before the race has even reached home roads. Stage 4 might be the single most dangerous stage of the opening week, and it barely breaks 105 kilometers. Short stages get a reputation for being easy, but this one packs nearly 3,000 meters of elevation gain into a route that starts and finishes in Andorra la Vella, tackles 4 separate climbs, and ends with a technical downhill run to the line. Short and brutal is a far more dangerous combination than long and steady, because there's no time to recover between efforts and no room for a bad day. Anyone who loses time here is going to be chasing shadows for the rest of the race. By the time the race finally reaches Spanish soil, around Stage 5, most fans watching at home will assume the hardest part is over. It is not. Stage 7 brings a brand new summit finish at the ski resort of Aramon Valdelinares, where the final 9.8 kilometers average just under 6%, following a run-in where the last 50 kilometers are mostly uphill. Stage 9 might be the toughest stage of the entire route on paper, climbing the Category 1 Alto de Aitana, 22 kilometers at just under 6%, as part of a day that packs over 5,000 meters of vertical gain into a single stage. Riders who survive that one will have earned every second of the following rest day. The 3rd week is where this Vuelta goes from difficult to genuinely cruel. Multiple summit finishes are packed into the closing stages, building toward a finale that race designers have openly described as one of the hardest conclusions to a Grand Tour in recent memory. The climb to Peñas Blancas takes riders from sea level to over 1,200 meters of altitude in one uninterrupted 18.8 kilometer effort, averaging 6.5% a climb that punishes anyone who has been surviving on fumes, rather than genuine form. And that's before the race even reaches its true final boss, the brutal Collado del Alguacil, finished deep in the Sierra Nevada. A climb so demanding that route designers essentially built the closing week of this Vuelta around breaking whoever is left standing. Now here's the part that turns this from a hard route into appointment viewing. Today, Pogačar is expected back at the Vuelta, Eta España, for the first time in 7 years. His last appearance came in 2019, when he arrived as an unknown 20-year-old, won 3 stages, and finished 3rd overall in what remains one of the most stunning Grand Tour debuts of the modern era. Since then, he has won the Tour de France multiple times, added a Giro d'Italia title, and collected multiple World Championship road race titles, becoming one of only a handful of riders in the sport's history to complete the career sweep of all 3 Grand Tours. A win in Granada would complete that set, and this route, with its brutal climbing totals and its refusal to offer a single easy day, looks custom-built for exactly the kind of rider he has become. He won't have it easy, though, and that's precisely what makes this Vuelta worth clearing your schedule for. Primož Roglič, the rider with more Vuelta titles than anyone else racing today, has confirmed he'll return in pursuit of a record-breaking 5th overall win, a milestone that would separate him from the sport's other great Vuelta specialists. João Almeida, a rider who has quietly built one of the most consistent Grand Tour records in the current peloton, lines up as a serious threat as well, and there's real uncertainty around whether defending champion status changes hands again this year, since the rider who won the 2025 edition is not guaranteed to return and defend the jersey. Add in climbers who thrive specifically on this kind of relentless terrain, and you have the ingredients for a genuinely unpredictable 3 weeks rather than a coronation. If you're new to the channel and you want to actually understand what you're watching when the Vuelta kicks off in August, hit subscribe now, because we'll be breaking down every mountain stage, every time trial, and every tactical twist as the race unfolds. And you don't want to miss a single one of those breakdowns once the racing actually starts. There's also a weather element that rarely gets talked about, but genuinely changes how this race plays out. Late August and early September in southern and central Spain means brutal heat, often pushing well past 35 degrees Celsius on exposed climbs with no shade and no relief. Combine that with 3 weeks of accumulated fatigue and climbing totals this extreme, and you get a race where dehydration, cramping, and simple heat exhaustion become as much of a threat to a rider's chances as any attack from a rival. Teams have started building entire hydration and cooling protocols specifically around Vuelta stages for exactly this reason, because the margin between finishing strong and completely blowing up in the final week can come down to something as unglamorous as core body temperature. Put all of that together, the altitude, the heat, the sheer volume of vertical climbing, and a start list that includes some of the strongest Grand Tour riders currently racing, and you start to understand why this route has already earned a reputation before a single pedal stroke has been turned in anger. Race designers didn't build a Vuelta that rewards patience and conservative racing. They built one that punishes hesitation, rewards riders willing to gamble on early attacks, and offers almost no flat terrain where tired legs can simply hide and recover. Every single stage in that final week has the potential to blow the general classification wide open, which is exactly what makes Grand Tour racing worth watching in the first place. So, mark your calendar for the 22nd of August, because whatever else happens across the cycling calendar this year, the 2026 Vuelta a España is shaping up to be appointment television for anyone who genuinely loves this sport. Whether Pogačar completes his career Grand Tour sweep, whether Roglič claims that record 5th title, or whether some climber nobody is talking about right now uses this brutal route to announce themselves on the biggest stage in the sport, one thing already seems certain. Nobody is going to survive these 3 weeks unscathed. If this kind of route breakdown is exactly the content you come here for, drop a comment down below telling us which stage in this route worries you the most, because we read every single one and it genuinely shapes what we cover next. And if you want to catch every Vuelta preview before the race actually starts, make sure that notification bell is turned on so you don't miss a single upload between now and the 22nd of August. Let's talk about the time trial situation too, because it plays a bigger role in this race than most fans realize. Beyond that opening test in Monaco, the route includes a flat 32-kilometer individual time trial in Jerez de la Frontera on stage 18, bringing the total time trial distance to around 41 kilometers. That's a relatively modest amount for a 3-week race, which tells you everything about how this Vuelta wants to be won. Route designers deliberately limited the flat, pan-flat time trial kilometers that reward pure power riders, and loaded the race instead with climbing, which shifts the balance of power firmly toward pure climbers and puncheurs, rather than time trial specialists who might otherwise claw back minutes on a flat course. If you're a rider who built your season around raw watts on a flat road, this route was not designed with you in mind. Stage 12 deserves its own mention because it revisits terrain that produced fireworks the last time the Vuelta passed through, in 2017. 3 introductory climbs soften the legs before the finale, including the demanding Alto de Velafik, a climb that stretches past 13 kilometers and has a habit of shattering the peloton into small, isolated groups long before the final kilometer. Stages like this rarely decide a Grand Tour outright, but they quietly separate the riders with genuine form from the ones who are simply surviving on reputation, and by the 3rd week, those distinctions become impossible to hide. Then there's the sheer geography of the race to consider. This edition travels from Monaco through the south of France, briefly ducks into Andorra, and only then works its way down through the eastern and southern half of Spain toward the finish in Granada. That kind of routing means constant transfers, changing time zones for viewing depending on where you're watching from, and a peloton that rarely gets a genuinely flat, low-stress stage to simply recover on. Grand Tours with a foreign Grand Depart tend to front-load a certain amount of chaos into the opening week, simply because riders are racing on roads they've never seen before, and this year's course compounds that with real elevation gain from stage 1 onward, rather than easing the field in gently. It's also worth remembering just how rare a route like this actually is in the modern era of the sport. Race organizers across all 3 Grand Tours have trended toward slightly more conservative, made-for-television routes in recent seasons, often with an eye toward keeping racing close and unpredictable rather than letting one dominant climber ride away from the field early. The 2026 Giro d'Italia and Tour de France routes both reflect that trend, built with an eye toward tempting general classification riders into doubling up across multiple Grand Tours in the same season. The Vuelta has gone the opposite direction entirely. Race organizers appear to have built this route specifically to punish anyone who arrives even slightly undercooked, which raises an obvious question heading into the summer. Will riders who already raced a brutal Tour de France in July have anything left in the tank for a Vuelta built like this one, or will this race become the domain of specialists who saved their entire season for these 3 weeks in late summer? That tension between doubling up stars and dedicated Vuelta specialists is exactly what makes this route so fascinating to preview months in advance. A rider who wins the Tour in July and arrives at the Vuelta still fresh enough to handle 58,000 meters of climbing would be making an extraordinary statement about their own condition and depth. A rider who skips the Tour entirely and builds their whole season around peaking for Monaco and Granada is betting everything on a single 3-week window. Both approaches carry real risk, and this particular route is unforgiving enough that either strategy could blow up spectacularly on live television. One more thing worth flagging before we wrap this up. Grand Tour organizers have increasingly used punchy, technical finishing circuits and uphill drag finishes on so-called sprint stages to prevent the race from ever fully settling into a predictable rhythm. And early reporting on this route suggests the 2026 Vuelta continues that trend. Stage 2's uphill finish toward Manosque is a good early example favoring a hardened, punchy finisher over a pure sprinter, which means even the stages that look flat on a profile chart are unlikely to produce a straightforward bunch gallop. Expect breakaways to have real chances throughout this route, not just in the mountains, because the terrain simply doesn't offer sprinters' teams many clean opportunities to fully control the stage from start to finish. It also helps to understand just how the Vuelta earned its reputation as cycling's most unpredictable Grand Tour in the first place. Unlike the Tour de France, which has settled into a fairly recognizable rhythm over the decades, the Vuelta has always leaned into extreme, sometimes brutally steep finishes that simply don't exist anywhere else on the calendar. Ramps that occasionally tip past 20% gradient for short, savage bursts. That willingness to build stages around genuinely punishing terrain, rather than smoothing everything out for a clean television picture, is part of why so many of the sport's most dramatic late-race collapses and comebacks have happened in Spain, rather than France or Italy. This year's route leans even harder into that identity, front-loading climbing from the very first week, rather than saving all of it for a dramatic final weekend. History also suggests that riders chasing a career Grand Tour sweep tend to bring a different kind of intensity to a race like this. When a rider has already won the other 2 Grand Tours and only needs the third to complete a set that fewer than 10 men in the sport's entire history have managed, the psychological stakes shift in a way that pure points or ranking chases simply don't replicate. Expect commentary throughout the race to center heavily on that narrative, and expect rival teams to race accordingly, because nobody wants to be remembered as the team that let a legacy-defining achievement happen on their watch without a fight. There's also the matter of team strategy heading into a route this demanding. Directors sportifs building rosters for this Vuelta will almost certainly prioritize pure climbing domestiques over time trial specialists or sprint lead-out riders. Given how few flat, controllable kilometers this route actually offers, expect smaller, punchier team lineups built around getting a single leader over 7 summit finishes rather than the more balanced rosters you'd see at a flatter, more sprinter-friendly Grand Tour. That kind of roster construction tends to produce more aggressive, opportunistic racing throughout the middle stages too, since teams without a dedicated sprinter to protect have far less incentive to simply control the bunch and save their efforts for the mountains. By the time the peloton reaches that final brutal week, expect time gaps that would be almost unthinkable on a flatter route. Repeated summit finishes in quick succession have a compounding effect on fatigue that a single hard mountain stage simply doesn't produce, and this route stacks several of its hardest days close together rather than spacing them out with recovery terrain in between. That's precisely the kind of finale that has decided Vueltas in the past, where a rider who looked comfortably in control with a week to go suddenly loses everything across 2 or 3 consecutive, brutal afternoons, while a climber who was quietly biding their time seizes the red jersey in the race's final days. So when the flag drops in Monaco on the 22nd of August, keep all of this in mind. This isn't just another Grand Tour route. It's a route built to punish complacency, reward specialists, and produce exactly the kind of chaotic, unpredictable racing that has made the Vuelta a España essential viewing for serious cycling fans for decades.